ANC's political future, particularly in an election year, is going to be very difficult to put to the foreground, considering the corruption challenges and all the other issues that continue to plague its leadership. Where to from here? Let's have a chat now with political analyst Dr. Somadoda Fikeni as well, who joins us via video link. Doctor, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. Then it's a difficult year, of course, for everybody, following through from last year to this year. But do you think the ANC can sort of withstand this latest test for not just its branches, but for its own leadership?
Well, I do think that, let me start by saying ANC has had a long record of dealing with crisis, contradictions, and near splits. So it is more adept than other parties in those internal contradictions. And therefore, we would still expect it to be a prominent player in the space. And contextualizing that, ANC weaknesses alone would not amount to its demise. It would also take stronger opposition parties. And we do know for a fact that the major opposition party is also experiencing its own internal challenges. So we do have generally a deeper political crisis in the system itself.
Yeah. So I suppose, would it mean then that the ANC almost rests on its laurels, knowing then that, its own competition isn't giving it a hard run at this stage?
One could say that to some degree, but also it is possible that we should pose another question as to whether ANC itself is able to self-correct without an external push or without any other developments, because that's another issue where people are beginning to say a party so divided, moving towards the legal challenges of some members of these different contesting factions, which are beginning to weaponize those as a political witch hunt. Will it move towards the direction of self-correction, or will it move deeper into the crisis that it is experiencing, therefore pushing the country itself into a deeper challenge as well?
Yeah. I suppose the aspect then of recent times, particularly with issues around Ace Magashule as well, as the spokesperson for the presidency, which yes may not necessarily be ANC linked as yet, but I mean, of course, the NEC members that are involved in all of that has affected it somewhat. Does that weaken the stance of the ANC going into this election year?
To some degree, it will have an impact, but at the same time, we should be cautious. Look at the by-elections that were being held right in the midst of these PPE scandals, in the midst of the revelations of Zondo Commission. You saw the ANC able to claw back some of its support despite all this. And one of the reasons for that is the fact that there are no stronger alternatives at the moment that have presented a compelling case. And even if there were alternatives, the issue of credibility and believability is yet another thing which takes a bit of time. The second one, all political parties going into this election will struggle with mobilizing finances and resources because the companies they will have been depending on have suffered under COVID-19, and even some of those that were strong backers of the ruling party, your Bosasas, your Guptas, as well as other companies, the Saudis, which are private business people and so forth, are experiencing their own legal challenges. And there are these laws to expose the funders of the parties. So that in itself presents a problem for the ANC. It also presents a problem for the political parties across the spectrum going into these elections. So ANC, it is possible, could say the reason the state is moving on those who are corrupt is showing that we are serious about fighting corruption, even though it's some of its own members.
Yeah.
That is the challenge that one can see. Even with the COVID intervention, 350 rands, they will say we tried our best, But of course, it will exhaust, which means they'll have to deal with the explanation of why it is no longer continuing at a certain point.
Yeah. How much focus will there be on policy, you think, this time around? And I only ask because there's significant movements that they've tried to make, and yet it does feel like the implementation of any of that has continued to be their biggest stumbling block. Does that continue to be the case now, considering that policies have always been a bit of a worry for them?
Well, I do think that policy for South Africa and for the ANC has never been a major problem. Had South Africa implemented the RDP and be effective in its implementation, had they implemented just half or even a quarter of the policies they promised, the country would be far away. The biggest problem we have is the state capacity to translate policies into implementation. The second biggest problem is the lack of leadership, decisive, audacious, strong leadership. And the third one is corruption. So if you were to deal with those issues, even with the policies that you have, you would go a long way. It doesn't matter that you talk of the land constitutional clause being changed, if when you distribute that, the process could be exposed to corruption.
Yeah, certainly still the case on that front. Do you think voter apathy is coming to the fore a lot more, in the sense that less and less people are looking to politics as a whole in general at this time, and perhaps just looking for clear and concise leadership, and they're just not finding it?
That is probably the biggest problem that we've seen over time. Almost over half of the eligible voters now don't bother to vote. And now that number tends to be even worse when it comes to local government elections, which means there is a legitimacy crisis and also a structural crisis in our politics, even beyond elections. And some people can no longer make a connection between the election outcome and the improvement of their livelihood. More so in local government, where there was a hope that coalition arrangement, which was touted as an alternative, would do better. When it faltered and crumbled, then they lose one more possibility of counterbalancing the dominant ANC.
Yeah.
And also when the DA in the places such as Tshwane started being fingered on corruption as well, then the average voter will simply say that it looks like the political elite is prone to corruption, no matter which political party it could be.
Yeah.
They will still as large a slice as they can afford to access.
Doctor, what would you like then the President Cyril Ramaphosa of the ANC then to perhaps put in his January 8 statement that would perhaps be exemplary of leadership? A clear example of leadership, a clear example of perhaps a change in direction for the ANC?
The first one would be to spend a bit of time on the issue of the state capacity to say, we've had good policies, but they never get implemented. And this is how we are going to contract our ministers and departments and have clear performance agreements, clear deliverables, which, if not implemented, there will be consequences. The second one would be to say, for those involved in corruption, we are not going to interfere politically to prevent the law to take its course. Now it is no longer in our political hands. Whether a person had aligned themselves with me as the president or with the other factions, it wouldn't really matter. That is another strong message that is needed. The third one would be the economic recovery, as well as dealing with COVID-19, especially the issue of vaccination. That in itself, I think, to me, would be key. Of course, the growing crisis of immigrants in the borders and how you manage them is something that they cannot ignore, because any development planning, any service delivery, if you do not have the figures, even when you fight crime, as to who is in, who is out, whether from rural areas or from other countries, then you can't even begin seriously to say you are going to impact on development in any serious manner.
Yeah. Dr. Somadoda Fikeni, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciated their political analyst as we unpack the January 8th statement then by the African National Congress today, of course, celebrating 109 years of existence as the political party or a political party in South Africa, indeed looking as the lead party going into this election year, but just how difficult circumstances have been and just what happens when it comes to policy.